Thanks, everyone. We'll get underway in just about 1 more minute. Just getting the live stream happening. All right, I think that's enough getting started, letting people tune in. So let's get going. Good morning, good day, good evening, wherever you happen to be. Most of this audience, I expect, will be Australian-based, but maybe there's some people tuning in from overseas as well. Welcome to this webinar by 6 Clicks on adopting a risk-based approach to Australian government cybersecurity requirements. We are, as I mentioned, broadcasting live via Zoom, as well as LinkedIn and YouTube. Thanks for joining. Our thoughts are for anyone dealing with extreme weather events that are occurring right across Australia in the recent days and weeks. We're going to lightly touch on some of the Australian government cybersecurity requirements, but that won't be all. We'll get stuck into how we can approach those requirements using a risk-based approach. So before that, we might have to explain what we mean by risk-based. So let's do some introductions first, though. I'm Andrew Robinson, founder and Chief Information Security Officer at 6 Clicks, and it looks like we've got most of the people who are going to be joining with us now. We'll have some questions and answers towards the end, and this session is being recorded for playback as well subsequently. So let's do those introductions. We've got David Simpson on the line from CyberCX. David is an executive director for the CyberCX GRC practice and brings in excess of 36 years of experience. Is that right, David? That is a whole bundle of experience.
Yeah, that's true.
David, I believe it. David is highly qualified, holding his CISM, CISA, and CISP credentials, no doubt, hold those for a long time. He also brings with him extensive business experience, holding an MBA and having led 2 specialist information security firms in the most senior management roles in those organizations. David's areas of specialties are in information security strategies, frameworks, standards, information security policies, and organizational risk management. All of the fun stuff like me and Peter, David. David is also experienced in the integration of multiple management systems, including those based on ISO 27001, of course, for information security management system, ISO 27000 for IT service management, I think it is, and ISO 9001, which is definitely for quality management, and no doubt some of that feeds into your thinking when it comes to information security and risk management, David. In 2018, David was recognised by his peers as an AISA Australian Cybersecurity Professional of the Year, and in 2021 was appointed a Fellow of AISA. So only the best on this panel, David and Peter, I'm referring to. That is, as the National Executive Director for Governance, Risk and Compliance, David is responsible for the strategic growth of the practice and oversight of CyberCX's most critical GRC assignments. That is quite the introduction, but well deserved, David. Going with our second guest speaker, Peter Farrelly. He is the CISO at AUCloud, and AUCloud is an Australian cloud service provider providing sovereign cloud services to both public and private sector in Australia. Originally, as a startup organisation, he's been busy building its cybersecurity practice and is required to maintain a number of cybersecurity standards and compliance to those, no doubt, for the services that AUCloud provides. I must also add, it was great to finally meet you, Peter, and your team face-to-face last week at the AISA CyberCon 2022 in Melbourne. It was a great conference. Good to meet you there as well, David. Peter has around 20 years of experience across public and private sector, predominantly in the federal government sector, where he's held a number of key roles and in a number of key agencies. He draws on a broad technical and advisory background to drive business outcomes in practical and meaningful ways, which has got to come in handy when you're dealing with something like the Australian Government Information Security Manual. Peter is also highly qualified and holds several qualifications like CISM, CISA, C-Risk, and also IRAP, which I think will come in handy for today's discussion. He's worked closely with the ACSC over many years and is regularly asked to provide input and direction on a variety of cybersecurity initiatives being planned by government. He'll be sharing his perspectives as a CISO that needs to comply with those Australian government cyber and information security requirements in order to work closely with Australian government departments and agencies. So we've got both sides of the coin there, David, representing the world of consultancy and what that has to offer in cutting through the complexity of Australian government requirements. And Peter, as well as myself, as a CISO at 6 Clicks on how we handle those requirements from an internal point of view and manage that on behalf of the organisations that we work for. So thanks for joining us, guests and panel members. So panel members, would you like to say hi to the audience as well?
Good morning, everybody.
Yes, nice to be here. Yeah, same here. Good morning, afternoon, evening, and looking forward to today's conversation.
Should be good. So I do have a bit of a run sheet here that gives us an idea of where we might want to base the discussion, but very much looking forward to going off piste or off script with Peter and David as we talk through this subject matter. Firstly, to frame up today's discussion, I'd like to make the observation that the Australian government requirements like the Information Security Manual have often been associated with compliance language. It was not so long ago that it was full of must and should statements. Do you remember those, Peter and David? But it's made a transition to becoming more risk-based. You know, we've got the sections called guidelines, and certainly both through our IRAP refresher training and the message coming out from ASD that our approach should be very much risk-based. But what does that mean? David, I was going to start with you as a champion of risk-based approaches to cyber and information security. What does risk-based actually mean? The conversation, I don't think, is held frequently enough, or certainly I don't think we've yet reached the point where there's a common understanding. So I wonder if you could shed some light on that one for us.
Sure, Andrew, and thank you. And you're correct that the transition from a compliance view of the world to a risk view of the world is certainly gaining speed and momentum. Risk-based approach is one where the control choices that we make as organisations is shaped by our view on what's important and valuable to us. And the focus then becomes allow us to prioritise controls activities that help us to manage those areas which are most important to our business. And what we get from that type of strategy is a tailored approach to us as a specific organisation and the organisation's needs and its security objectives, which should be aligned with its strategic business objectives, and therefore gets more opportunity to gain some real traction within the business and some real support within the business, because we clearly are making choices that are designed to help the business address what's important to them and their challenges. We can make informed investment decisions and best use of what is a limited cyber budget. And it's a transition that's been going on for some time, and the ISM is a clear example of a shift from a compliance to a risk-based strategy, but it's not the only one. You know, the UK government started in mid-90s with its version of BS 7799, which was standard that drove the creation of ISO 27001, which is now adopted internationally for that. But we've also got the NIST cybersecurity framework, which gets a fair amount of traction in some organisations in Australia, which is also risk-based. And again, approaches the view of cyber risk in a more cost-effective, practical and pragmatic manner, rather than just a straight compliance approach. Does that make some sense in terms of how we've transitioned to a model that's much more aligned with what the business needs and our organisation needs, rather than a checklist of controls that may not address what's important to us?
I like that one, David. The key takeaway I take from what you're saying there is that you have to understand the business needs and requirements as a prerequisite to following a risk-based approach, and then sort of align and your security controls and enable the successful delivery of those business outcomes with risk treatments that are appropriate. So I really like that. Is there anything you've got to add there, Peter? Or I've also got a follow-up question from David.
No, all good from my perspective at the moment.
Cool. All right. So David, you mentioned there a little bit around compliance as well. I just wondered if you could explain whether compliance is still a thing in your view, or whether we're now pursuing risk-based approaches at the exclusion of compliance. Is there room for minimum standards any more? And if so, who sets them? Is that a tricky question, or am I allowed to ask it?
You're certainly allowed to ask it. It has its complexities. Do we see compliance dying out? In many organisations, yes, but we still see pockets of that. Some organisations still prefer a compliance approach where they know clearly what they need to implement. They don't have to go through the process of a risk-based strategy where you go and identify what's important to you and do your risk assessments and things. They like being told they need to do this. Now, that can generate a tick and flick approach to security where they go, yes, I've ticked all my little checklist of controls off, which is obviously presents some risk to the organisation, given that some of those controls may not be effective in managing the challenges the particular organisation is facing. But an example of a compliance strategy, for instance, can be the focus on the Essential 8, for instance, where we've got some key objectives that government and many in the private sector are now saying this forms a basic level of controls we want to have in place. We need the controls to address these 8 strategies. And that's very much a compliance strategy, but you can't just have the Essential 8. You need to start considering a much broader picture. And in the cyber battlefront, if you like, that we face today, compliance doesn't really cut the mustard. A regimented set of controls is not going to be all things to all people. And we need to be smarter than that.
Yeah, I take your point that it's about what we lead with. We've got to lead with the business strategy and then do a risk assessment and follow through with the right treatments and controls that flow from a risk-based approach, but not just picking standards and implementing the controls within them without that risk-based driver. But almost still, I think compliance plays a role where once you've done your risk assessment and you're expecting certain controls, we should be running those controls that we've selected from a risk-based point of view. We should comply with our policies and procedures as if they're driven and led by that risk assessment.
Yeah, Andrew, I think that's a very pertinent point in that the risk leads to compliance, not the other way around.
Yeah.
So your risks, you identify the controls helping you manage your risks. And then, of course, once you have done that, you've said what you're going to do, then you need to guarantee you do what you say. So
I'm going to quote you on that one, David. Risk leads to compliance. I like it. And again, I think it's worth having this discussion and sharing it with the community so that we can all understand this, because I think there's more work to be done there. So thanks for those key insights, David. I'm going to switch to Peter. So thanks for waiting patiently, chomping at the bit, no doubt, to share some of your experience and wisdom. So you help AUCloud on a day-to-day basis as the CISO, achieving high levels of compliance, or where that has been risk-led and risk-driven, to things like the ISM and Australian government requirements. I wonder if you can share some of the philosophy on how you handle such the large volume of requirements that stem from doing business with government. And we know that the ISM includes hundreds of requirements, orders of magnitude bit greater than something like ISO 27001 and NIST that David and I were talking about. So how do you do that, Peter?
Yeah. So it is still interesting. Obviously, as you said, there's 800 or 900 odd controls that you need to make an assessment against or take a look at. And even as an industry, I still come across people that tell me they're 100% ISM compliant, which always draws a bit of a wry smile from me, sort of thing. But it's not easy as well managing the ISM. Like I said, there's a large volume of controls there. But the real challenge, I think, in managing the ISM and that as a control set is obviously the frequency that it changes. That's part of the learning experience and the journey that the ACSC has been on since they've sort of taken on a whole of economy focus, where it's not just government departments using the ISM anymore. There's a broader range of industry partners or people that form part of supply chains to government that are having those controls sort of pushed down onto them as well. But we are starting to see a bit less of a cadence as far as how many of those changes are coming through. And I think the ACSC, as the sort of owner of the ISM as well, they've been making some changes in recent times. And obviously, we've seen the cloud security guidance that came out in 2020 that's about to go through a bit of a review itself. And then more recently, the gateway security guidance. But these are all things that are moves in the right direction. Still using the ISM controls as like the baseline settings, but sort of building on it from there, sort of with a little bit more guidance, depending on how you might be using the ISM sort of thing. But I guess, from my perspective as a CISO, I tend to focus on two key things: business context or scope, as David would like to call it from the consulting world, and business impact. So for me, understanding the business context and how a control set applies, or why you're applying a control, is sort of fundamental to any security program that I've run. And that does change from business to business. Obviously, as a cloud service provider, the things that I do might be very different to somebody that's operating in the energy sector or banking or finance or something like that. So, and then obviously, cybersecurity, obviously a little bit topical at the moment as well. Down at CyberCon, Andrew, there was a whole range of presentations on the SOCI legislation, and then obviously we've got the high-profile security incidents in Australia with Optus and now Medibank. So it's nice that security is kind of cool at the moment. People taking a bit more of an interest. But once we understand that business context of what we're trying to protect and how we're going to approach it, then obviously we need to understand the business impact, which is essentially the consideration or the risk management of why we either choose to do something or in some cases choose to do nothing, depending on what we're doing. So for me, they're the two things, understanding the business context and then understanding the business impact of what I'm going to be applying, or, in some cases it might be introducing a new security control, and things like that. So understanding that business impact for us as an organisation is pretty, one of the key considerations as far as, when we look at control sets, and not necessarily just the ISM, but any standard that we have to comply with. We'll take a look at things, and in some cases we might agree with that control and implement something. We might need to go and get some business investment or whatever the case may be. But sometimes it might be, is there a way for us, based on my organisational needs, to work smarter? I might implement a different control or a mitigating control or a combination of controls that meet the intent of that. But obviously, when we're talking about risk-based decision making, that's my decision as a CISO as to how we do that.
Sure, I get it. So when you're talking about business impact there, Peter, you're thinking about the impact of not having a control, but also the impact of having the control, and maybe does that extend as far as looking at some unintended consequences that the control might introduce, and whether there's better alternatives. So you're sort of looking at both sides of the impact equation.
Yeah, very much so, definitely.
Cool. Yeah, I can see how all this requires a CISO to be very intimately familiar with the business that they're operating in. You can't just take a standard that you've implemented somewhere else and roll it out the same way in another organization. That scope and context and understanding of the business is really quite critical. Anything to add on that, David, or I'm going to continue this thread with Peter on risk assessment, actually move from impact into likelihood a little bit. But yeah, David, anything to add on that?
Just so as Peter mentioned, we about context and scope and the business consequence and the impact. Consequence forms a critical part of all of our risk choices and decisions, and you're going to talk about likelihood in a moment. But I certainly strongly encourage people to consider those conversations with the business about the business impact. It feeds into business continuity as well as cybersecurity, information security. So it has a number of benefits to the organisation.
Yeah, agree. I think that maybe the other thing to throw into the mix when we're thinking about impact is really around the information assets, the systems, the sensitivity of the information. And no doubt that's going to have a bearing on that business impact calculation and discussion that you're having with the board or senior executives. I said I was going to sort of move the conversation along from impact into likelihood. With the ASD and the ISM, and I know I've done my IRAP refresher training that was mandatory, and you probably have too, Pete. I could see, coming from a technical background at ASD and ourselves, I guess, there's this focus that the ASD has is almost re-emphasizing on threat modeling. So I wondered if you could give us some idea whether you're doing anything with threat modeling to feed into your likelihood assessment, maybe your impact assessment as well, but also the likelihood of different things going wrong or occurring in an organization or system.
I can touch on a few things there, most definitely. I wouldn't necessarily say that threat modelling is new to the ISM. They've had different flavours of it included over the years, and obviously most of it's sort of focused on application development and that secure development life cycle. But it's definitely had varying degrees of emphasis over that time. But thankfully, especially the software development piece within the ISM, that's been somewhat lagging for a number of years, but sort of definitely starting to see a greater emphasis on that now, which is really positive, because as we all know, that software, whether it's in the supply chain or the services you supply, is essentially critical to how you're likely operating as a business. But when we talk about threat modeling, obviously more recently we're starting to focus on things such as TTPs and cyber threat intelligence and the MITRE ATT&CK framework, and obviously there's a whole range of SDLC or software development life cycles and things like that people can draw on. So there's definitely some good guidance out there. But I think if I draw on some of that sort of, understanding the business impact, you don't always necessarily need to sort of go down that rabbit hole of following a specific framework or anything like that. So obviously you need to, as David mentioned in his opening, you need to tailor things to your business and your organisation, sort of thing. So we often find, that a lot can still be achieved just by sitting down and understanding that business context, what your organisation does, and then what threats or attack vectors might be relevant to protect against. If I use AUCloud as an example, obviously availability is really important to us. We're a cloud company, it needs to be up, it needs to be available, all that sort of thing. But that might be, secondary to confidentiality or integrity based on another business or organisation. And in some cases, we've got a range of customers that sort of span public and private sectors. And for some of those that I'll say have more sensitive data sets and that sort of thing, we actually sit down with them and run threat workshops try to understand their business. So for even us, forming part of their supply chain, is there things that we can do better? Is there things that we can help to alleviate their own attack surface that might also then have a potential flow-on effect for AUCloud and our other customers? But we really sit down and try to understand what type of adversaries they might expect to come against, or even if we just go back to really information security basics of confidentiality, integrity, availability, trying to understand what are their key focuses as an organisation and that sort of thing. So trying to work with them as much as possible to reduce that footprint or their attack surface for them, sort of thing. So that's how we've typically looked at threat modelling within AUCloud. I will say it's probably a little bit more on the technical side of threat modelling. But I think as we grow and expand ourselves as well, I think we'll probably start to take more of an enterprise view of that as well. Because, obviously, for us, our supply chain, data center providers, things like that, we need to have a good understanding of how they're mitigating some of those threats as well. And do they see their threat profile changing over time? In Australia, obviously, we've had bushfires, floods, and different things for a number of years now, almost to the point that, some people say they're almost the norm, sort of thing. But, how does that impact our business? Do we need to consider, a whole range of things, more diversification, more locations, all sorts of things for our operations and how we actually continue to provide services to our customers?
Yeah, I really like this focus on threat modelling. So we talked about our programs being risk-led, but sometimes if the discussion isn't at a mature level, risk can sometimes be seen as a way to accept high degrees of risk and not necessarily put all of the controls in place that an organisation maybe should have in place. But if by that focusing on threat modelling, we sort of keep it real and make sure that we have the right degree of protection in places. So I like that focus, and I'm going to pass a question over to David from a GRC or even from a broader consulting organisation perspective. I know CyberCX has many other teams beyond just GRC. So I was wondering if you could offer your thoughts on threat modelling, is it something that should be performed by the modern day GRC consultant, or are there other teams and should there be integration between those doing threat modelling and threat assessments and the GRC teams in order to get the best outcomes?
Yeah, and I think that we have to consider the environment we operate in, and it's rapidly changing, evolving from a threat landscape perspective. I think that when you're considering even risks, you must take into account the threat landscape. And so your risk assessments and risk and threat analysis needs to occur. Now, fortunately, from my perspective, our team have access to our threat intelligence people and a broader group of professionals. But the best way to get a successful outcome is to have informed people. You've got to be well informed when you make these risk decisions, and that information needs to come from multiple sources, both internally from our perspective, but also from our suppliers and our partners and our customers to help us shape the threat landscape a little more clearly for our organisation, and then allow us to make good risk decisions based on that. So we don't have the cyber unicorns who know everything about everything. So we do need to interact, and it's not just with humans. It's using artificial intelligence tools and using other support mechanisms to allow us to get as much information, as much useful information as quickly as we can to make these choices. We can't take 4 months to make a risk choice. We need to be fairly responsive and timely, and to do that, we need to be well informed. And I think that's where threat modelling and threat intelligence play a vital role in making better risk choices for the business.
Sure. And no one person can do it alone. So you've got to distribute that load of learning, keeping each other informed. So very, very much about partnership and community, I think, staying on top of the threats. So thanks for that contribution, David. Peter, as a CISO, what role do you see for partners in this threat hunting or threat intelligence world, and making sure that your risk assessments are sort of current, valid, and up to date when it comes to what's going on in the real world?
Constantly evolving is how I would describe it. Definitely keeps us very, very busy at AUCloud. But I guess, part of my role as a CISO is ultimately to build trust. And that's obviously both internally and externally. So I think, obviously need to be a good communicator sort of thing as well. So having that communication piece in place, and obviously, communication's key focus, but, again, need to tailor that approach. How I speak to my board might be different to how I speak with my executives, and how I approach a customer can vary from customer to customer as well. Are you just a direct customer, or are you a partner that's providing services on top of AUCloud? So, these things vary greatly, and you do need to be a good communicator to have those conversations in the first place. But I think a lot of this sort of, working with partners and different things also needs to be a continuous process as well. I'll say maybe a little bit sadly, but in our industry, you still see a lot of risk management effort that's just done or seen as shelfware. Yes, I did that at a point in time, and I have one of those. And should David or CyberCX come through as auditors, I can take it off the shelf and say, yes, I have one of those, or if my board asks for it, I can point to it. But obviously, there's immense value in reducing risk to your business by regularly reviewing those risks and communicating change across the business. For any security program that I've been part of, security awareness is a key factor in being able to educate the business as to the steps we're taking, and that's why it's sort of really important and powerful as well. So, security awareness isn't just, phishing and things like that. We take a really holistic view to security awareness at AUCloud. And a lot of that is also educating our entire workforce around, hey, these are the risks that we have as an organisation. I'm not saying we, share the entire risk register, but these are the key risks that we're aware of and that we focus on. And these are how we're addressing them, or this is why we're introducing a new process or a new technology, or whatever the case may be, to help us address that as an organisation, actually reduce our risk profile, sort of thing. So, and obviously for us, if we're reducing our risk profile, I come back to that trust thing again. If I can reduce my risk profile, hopefully my customers trust me more, and hopefully they do more business with me.
I like it. Another lesson learned for me, I'm learning lots, is that focus you have there on building trust and communicating to achieve it, and how following a risk-based approach and feeding it and making sure it's informed and accurate and up to date through threat modeling is going to help to align people in terms of how safe they feel and how safe in fact they are. So I think that's really, really useful in building trust. David, anything to add on the human side? Otherwise, I'm going to switch tack to talk a little bit about technology.
I think Peter calls out some very pertinent and areas of focus. Great communications. We rely on our people to do their jobs, and if they don't have a great framework, a solid framework for making those choices on how they do that, then we get exposed. So humans are very smart creatures. We can put as many technical controls in place, but if we get in the way of them doing something that they want to do, they'll find another way. So we need to bring them along the journey. They need to know why certain things are in place and why choices have been made to do certain things, why the controls are what they are.
Yeah, thanks, David. Peter, I'm wondering how you see technology playing a role that, in a way that complements the humans and the role that they have to play. Is there a role for technology to help with security risk management? And is that limited to technical controls like firewalls and intrusion detection and the like, and or can technology also help facilitate some of this threat and risk management work that we have to do?
Yeah, I mean, most definitely. And, you know, I could recommend 6clicks as a tool, definitely, that may assist in that. But, you know, that's coming more from a GRC perspective. But, you know, when we talk about threat modeling and reducing that risk, you know, obviously, you know, frequent and regular automated vulnerability scanning, you know, things like that are very powerful as far as actually making sure that you've got the knowledge and insight into your own systems. You know, obviously working in IT, you know, things are constantly changing, and we're applying patches and applying updates, and so too is our supply chain in all parts of our technology stacks that we're operating. So, you know, making sure that we've got, you know, that automated scanning and vulnerability assessment happening on an ongoing basis is a big thing that we focus on at AUCloud, making sure that we've got that visibility as though we were sitting on the outside of our organisation. And then obviously, you know, even more recently, there's obviously, you know, a number of companies, your bug crowds and the like, that are, I think, making some pretty significant advancements as far as sort of technology goes. But, you know, when we talk about, you know, technology to assist in risk management as well and automating parts of that, you know, AUCloud, like many companies, you know, we work across different industries, different sectors. So, you know, it might at any one time be, you know, 3, 4, half a dozen standards or more that we need to comply with. So obviously any opportunity to automate some of that risk management work is seen as a win for us. So I definitely see that as a key factor. But the other fact that I think worth raising, and it's definitely something that before we started automating some of it, we used to definitely spend a lot of time and effort on, is obviously the supply chain risks and the multitude of questionnaires that we would get from various companies that we were doing business with and that sort of stuff. So I definitely see, you know, sort of automating some of those things where I could put my responses to a lot of common standards or frequently used standards, or in some cases at least just frequently asked questions. You know, being able to have a portal or a way of automating some of those responses so that I can instantly share that with a customer. You know, I come back to that trust thing as well. You know, if I can readily provide that information to a new customer or a potential customer, you know, that comes back to building that trust thing again, sort of thing. So, you know, here's my standards, here's my certifications, you know, here's my response to your questionnaire based on sort of whichever format or questionnaire standard you might be using, and being able to put that in front of them really quickly, I think goes a long way to building, you know, that trust and, you know, having quicker and faster conversations.
Really is that old adage, people, process and technology. David, do you have thoughts on the use of technology that you'd like to share?
And yes, Andrew, we come from the other side of the fence in that we're helping organisations manage their third-party risks and that was a classic example where technology can assist, because, you know, if you've got a 200, 300 service providers providing services to your organisation and trying to manage their conformance to your expectations, it's very challenging. It's very resource intensive, both from their side, as Peter just pointed out, and from the processing side at the back end, when we get all these responses back, these questionnaires that get filled in back. Tools like 6clicks, which we're using for that very specific purpose in a number of our customers, help us to automate that to a large degree in capturing the evidence and flagging what needs to be followed up on, and then we can task that out. We're living in an environment where we're resource short, right? We just don't have enough resources in the cyber world. We have to try to maximize the capability, the capacity of the resources we have, and having tools that can support that really make a significant difference in terms of speed to decision and in terms of overall risk minimisation, because you're managing your risks certainly faster, and that is where we can't afford the gap. We can't afford to have vulnerabilities out there for very extended periods of time, because as we have seen recently, everybody's a target.
They are. I'm getting lots of good quotes out of this webinar, David. I think you just added another one to the list. So if I put on my founder hat in addition to my CISO hat here at 6clicks, where I hold ISO 27001 and IRAP credentials as well, I'm also a strong believer that technology can help us through the assessment process, collecting information, as you say, Peter, maybe bringing it in from tools like vulnerability management tools, Qualys, Nessus, and bring it in to give us some idea of how our controls are performing, and then tie that control effectiveness effectively to our risk assessments and see whether they're accurate and reliable, or whether we might need to change them. The other role I think technology has to play is with implementing the requirements. So sure, we have our network and application layer controls, but we also have our security management activities related to this whole risk and compliance discussion that we've been having, making some of those activities easier. I think we talked about supply chain risk management is one, but there's plenty of others as well, just comparing your own policies against the requirements of any given standard like the ISM can be a time-consuming one. So advancements in AI and things like 6clicks, it's Haley AI can help with that, help empower both the consultant and the internal security teams to look at overlapping compliance requirements, look at their policies and standards and compare them against compliance requirements, and then take that and any time that has been gained, any efficiency, and spend that deep in thought around that likelihood impacts. Have we considered all the right threats and risks? And I anticipate that artificial intelligence might also start stepping into that field with time, to give us some idea around whether our likelihood assessments, our impact assessments are accurate and reliable enough. Helping the consultant, augmenting them, and putting the pressure on a little bit to make sure that they are staying up to date, as David also mentioned, and providing customers and organisations with the value based on their experience, especially where they work across industry. But what I would like to do is see if there's any final remarks from Peter and David, and I'll also scan the various forums for any questions that have come in. So let me find those while Peter and David make any final remarks that they have based on what we've talked about.
Peter, would you like to start?
Yeah, I think it was obviously a good discussion. But if there was any takeaways that I'd suggest listeners to sort of focus on, I think doing that risk management piece, really understanding that business context, really understanding that business impact, and if you've got the time, energy, and the resources, making sure that risk discussion or how you're presenting those risks to the organisation is something that's really continuous and not something that you just look at based on an audit date or a annual review, that sort of thing. So if you can make that continuous, you're actually really going to drive some business value within your organisation, and you'll definitely start to build trust and recognition amongst your peers as well.
And I'd support that in terms of the fact that the risk management is an ongoing life cycle, and that it should be a continuous process. And one thing that we should all recognise is that, the risks we're talking about here are risks to us not being able to deliver on our business objectives. Our security objectives should always support our business objectives. And the other thing that we should all have in the back of our minds is that we only implement controls to manage risks. So if we take a compliance-based approach and just implement controls that have no link back to risk, then we are wasting effort and potentially doing ourselves a disservice in terms of how the business is going to accept cybersecurity and information security within the business management systems that we expect. So, yeah, that's really my takeaway, that risks and controls are linked, and controls should only exist to manage risks, and risks exist against the business objectives.
That's it, David. I agree wholeheartedly. Good luck to anyone trying to do that in a spreadsheet, though. There's some complex relationships. So I've got a question here from James. James happens to be studying, he's an economist. I do happen to know James. He's got plenty of experience as an economist. So he's also now currently completing a Masters of Cybersecurity at La Trobe University, where his mantra is humans are the weakest link. His first question is for David. Do recent events, including Optus and Medibank breaches, give Australian CISOs a greater leverage in order to push the barrel of risk-based cybersecurity? And how would you have this conversation?
The answer to the first part is yes. It is a great lever at the moment. For instance, in the amount of questions and concerns that have been raised by boards of directors of companies back to our organisation recently, I mean, it's just gone through the roof. People are suddenly waking up at the top end, the executive end of an organisation, going, well, this can have a significant amount of damage to us. So the advantage, we don't have to use war stories now. They're in the press already. We have the ear of the board and executive management. This is the time to strike from a CISO's perspective. We've got this great opportunity to go in there and refocus funding priorities to ensure that the risks are better managed.
Great. Thanks, David. I've got another question here, which is, Peter, can you please speak a little bit about service level agreements, please? Maybe in your role as a CISO for a provider, you're on the receiving end of expectations around SLAs, but you know what's appropriate for you to offer, and maybe for other service providers to consider.
Yeah, I'll assume that's based on sort of how we sort of risk-based approaches and sort of how we do that. But you know, obviously as a cloud service provider, you know, one of our key measurements or metrics that we have to provide to customers is uptime, sort of thing. So when I link that back to risk-based controls and things that we implement within our environment, you know, there's a whole range of different things that we implement, and obviously, you know, from our customer's perspective, you know, uptime and availability of our services is critical to their own businesses. So, you know, things like DDoS and IDS and IPS, you know, all obviously very common things that we implement. But then it's how you implement those things as well. You know, do you know, as a sovereign cloud service provider, you know, do we need to accept traffic from the entire internet, or maybe can we use some geo-blocking or different things within our technology stack to reduce that footprint immediately, sort of thing. I'm not saying it's, you know, foolproof technology by any definition, but obviously if we can do things that reduce that risk or delay or avoid an attacker's ability to impact our customers and the services that they might host or provide on our AUCloud and indeed ourselves, you know, that's the steps that we take around service level agreements, and you know, we measure those. You know, obviously there's a lot of monitoring that goes into any SLAs, and that's everything from, you know, actually a service-driven SLA about, you know, a platform or a service being available, all the way through to, you know, customer interactions and how quickly we respond to you and how quickly we resolve incidents or downtime or anything like that. You know, those things are all key factors, but they're all risk-driven as well.
Yeah. Still very much with a focus, at least here in Australia, on availability, but I think you're hinting at some potential SLAs around time to respond if an incident occurred, metrics around confidentiality and agreements on those, probably a bit trickier. It's maybe where legislation plays a role.
Yeah, exactly. And obviously with the SOCI legislation that's just been released, and whether or not you're operating their definition of a critical asset and that sort of thing, obviously your time to respond and advise government or different people is tailored based upon the criticality of your asset, sort of thing. So, like the SOCI legislation, obviously starting to see some of that come through in other requirements at this point in time. So it's that's not just being driven by your own organisation. We're starting to see that being driven by outside forces as well.
And one last question, which is whether you're seeing that a recent legislation and regulation like the Critical Infrastructure Reform SOCI Act are doing better in that they're moving away from being prescriptive and are in fact minimally prescriptive and maybe increasing or maximising the scope for risk-based approaches.
I think they've got their risk approach is actually still out for comment as we speak. I don't know if maybe David can confirm or not, but so that's actually out for comment at the moment, and anybody can sort of contribute to that if they've got an interest in it. But obviously that's all very new legislation, and that will change and mature over time as well. And I think that's the end goal, that everybody matures and increases their resilience. And if we're doing good risk management and we understand our business, I think that'll only lead to greater resilience for the organisations that we work for.
David, anything to add on the nature of new and approaching laws and regulations and whether they support this whole risk-based approach we've been talking about?
I think that, as Peter called out, we've got the risk model that's out for SOCI at the moment to work through that and provide comment. I think that we are seeing this transition within the federal government space to, in its interactions with the private sector, to take a more risk-based model to provide some frameworks for those organisations to interact with them, like the Right Fit for Risk program for employment agencies, which is fundamentally a 27001 based risk model with controls from the ISM included. So we get a bit of start to see this mix of flavour where the ISM controls this quite large control set is being used as at least some controls from where it's a minimum set which they would expect to see, but you can make risk choices and risk assess them out if you feel that they don't meet your requirements and they don't align with what your organisation is doing. So we are seeing that transition, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. There's a question here around how we help or how organisations can deal with the difficulties implementing the ISM E8 and SRA security risk assessment, or if that's a particular standard. And I think we've covered that throughout this whole webinar. Of course, there may be little intricacies with the deployments of particular technologies, and my only advice with my CISO hat on is to get help. There's usually someone out there from a vendor or in the community that can help if you're having difficulties with particular technologies. But as far as a framework and approach goes, I think we've touched on it here, and hopefully we'll talk a lot more about it into the future. So I wanted to take the remaining time and make sure that I give credit where credit is due. I would really like to thank and show my appreciation to David and Peter for joining me on this panel and webinar. Obviously, it's been brought to you by 6 Clicks, but contributed to by David, who's from CyberCX, and Peter from AUCloud, and I very much thank you for your time and contribution. I have no doubt that people who have been enjoying this session live have got some key takeaways, and anyone who watches the recording will have similar. Thanks for your time, and unless there's anything else to add, Peter or David, I'll be ending the webinar.
Have a good night. Good day, everyone.
Thanks, guys. Thanks very much, Andrew. Thanks, David.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone. Much appreciated. See you. Bye.
Bye.